I'm Abby and this is Abby's Den. Welcome. So I have 3 overlockers to demonstrate seam allowances. Why have I got 3 different ones? The reason is all 3 of them have different ways of identifying your seam allowance. Now, I've got this really easy hooded top. When you buy a commercial pattern, you might download a pattern off the internet. You have allocated on your pattern pieces a seam allowance. Those seam allowances on a commercial pattern, they allow a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. When you've got the measurements on these machines, they are in inches, annoyingly. So you've got to work out how to make it in centimetres for you. Or those of you who want to, allow a little bit more and you want to work out how much you're going to trim away. Let me show you. Okay, so I've got my 2 sheets of fabric here. This might be the side of a skirt, it might be the side of a jacket, it might be something, that you're creating. So you might have already sewn a 5/8 seam allowance and you just want to finish the seam off, or it might be one of my projects and you're quite happy just to serge along. So this is a seam guide. Quite often they come like this in this dark colour. These are both made by Singer, but they get, because of this wide gap, they get a bit loose over time. So I'm going to chuck that one away, and I've got one which is a bit more firm. This holds in place better. This side is measured in inches and this side is measured in centimetres. So I want to mark my seam allowance 5/8 because I'm using a commercial pattern and they have a seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch. So that's a full inch there. So that's from this line here to there is a full inch. And I want to mark off 5/8. So I'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and just place this slider. So it moves along, but it's quite stiff on this one, which is good. So it holds in place there. Now it won't move if I fiddle with it. And what now I can do, can you see that whole of that line there sits quite flat against the fabric. So now I can mark my fabric at 5/8 there, and I'll do another one there. Join the dots, and I've given myself a 5/8 seam allowance. Okay, there we go. Now, so we can imagine this is a seam line. Let's start with the Janome. Now, Janome is a good company for helping you with the markings. Let me show you. So we've got the markings at a 5/8, and the dotted line represents the left needle. So all 3 dotted lines are the distance from that needle on the left to that dot. So we've got the left needle and we have the right needle, and we've got the 4 thread overlock setting. What I have on the foot are 2 little etches there. You can see those. Those represents the left needle and the right needle. The dotted lines represent the distance between the left needle and the right needle. So the dotted lines are the left needles by that L, and the right needle is represented by the solid lines from the right needle. Now, in all good placement, that etch there is exactly where that needle is. You see there, and that right needle is in perfect line with that line there, with that etching. So in theory I should have a 1/2 inch distance between that and that. Remember, I said we are working in imperial numbers, so that's 1/2 inch. And from the right needle, that's 1/2 inch to that etch. And then the 5/8 there. There we go, 5/8 there. And then that should be a full inch. So from the left needle there, that marking with that marking is a full inch. That marking and that 1 inch should be level with that. It's very difficult to show on a video. So there we go. So we've got 1 full inch there. We've got 1 full inch there, and that's your left needle and your right needle, left needle, right needle. So they're your 1 inches, 5/8 of an inch, and that's your 1/2 inch. So I've set the left needle on all of the machines with a red thread so we can identify the line when we sew it. Okay, so what you do then, because I've set this up with a 4-thread overlock, I'm going to be following this line here and how far away my seam allowance needs to be on that dotted line, so that this left needle will sew no closer into the garment than I need it to be. So I don't end up with the overlocking inside. So if that's my seam, so I've just sewn my bag and that's my sewing line, I don't want my overlocking to be along here. That will be no good. I want my overlocking to be at least on this line or inside that line. So if this is accurate, and it hopefully should be because it's brand new out of the box, I should be able to follow that dotted line, put the presser foot down, and I'll sew along. Now the other thing about this machine is there is 2 markings there. Those 2 markings will help me guide that line along there. So if I think my placement isn't quite right, if I lift the presser foot and shift that along, you can see I've got the placement right. You can see that edge of the fabric sits alongside that dotted line, and hopefully that red sewing line should now sit either on or just inside that line I've marked at 5/8. Now you've got to remember I'm using this as a tool to measure, and this is measuring as well, so they might not be exactly right. And there we go. So you can see my blue line, so that's my sewing machine line, and that red line represents my seam allowance. So the trimmer, the overlocker, has trimmed away the fabric that I don't need in the seam allowance and left me with 1/4 inch. So that's 1/4 inch, can you see if I put it to there? And that red line is the left needle, which is sitting just on the inside of that seam. So the advantage with having the markings on here is that you don't need to draw the lines. So where I've drawn the lines before, I won't need to draw the lines this time. So if I've cut this fabric out to be a skirt and I know the seam allowance is 5/8, I can just go ahead and just follow that line, that marking, and know that I've cut away the right amount of fabric to give me my seam finish. So if I've measured that, that will be 5/8 inch from that red line, and it's trimmed off exactly what I don't need. So I didn't need to draw the line on there. So there you go. Let's show you on the next machine. Right, so this time let's work on the Brother M343. It's similar again, all the settings and the distances, markings are very similar to all of the Brother machines. So you'll find that's consistent. So let's grab our piece of fabric. Now with the case of the Brother machine, it's a little bit trickier because they've got L and R and a 4. I really don't know what they are. I really do need to do some research on that and investigate what they are. I don't have the answer for you right now. But L and R represent left and right. Now you can see on the Janome, those markings were close to these needles. They're not in this instance. So I'm just guessing that this is telling you the name of this foot. That's all. So I'm going to just make that assumption it's the name of the foot. So this wall here sits in perfect line with the right needle. Now we want to work out what these lines are. So that 1/2 inch mark there for the left needle. So I've got 1/2 inch marked on there, 1/2 inch there, and that sits exactly with the 1/2 inch. That's your right needle now that I'm marking, and that sits like along there. So likewise, I've got a full inch. So let's place this on a full inch. That's going to be the mark there. And that is against the right needle this time. So it's not even against the left needle. It's against the right one. There we go. So you've got the left and the right needles there at 1/2 inch. So your left and your right are 1/2 inch there. That one is, let me put it on the 5/8. So the ruler's marked at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5/8 of an inch. If I lay that edge there, that's that needle. So that's the right needle. And again, that's the right needle for 1 inch. So they could have really put that on, but if that's the right needle, then that must be the left needle. So if I put that there, I need to follow that for my seam allowance. So if I just place my fabric in there, so there you go. So that's 5/8 of an inch there, cut away. And that is 1/4 of an inch. So you always know that the seam allowance left, the amount of fabric left is 1/4 of an inch. So always make sure that you allow at least 1/4 of an inch when you cut fabrics out. Correct. Now, if you're making adjustments with your knife, that calico with a 0.7 knife adjustment, and I place that on now I know that's going to be my seam allowance. I'm going to place that on there. What happens is my fabric is quite squished up, and you can see that the stitches aren't formed correctly. They are wrapped around, but they're not formed correctly, and I don't get the best result that I want to. And you can see I'm not on the seam allowance. So it affects the seam allowance, but it's bad settings. So it won't look quite right. If I pull those two pieces together, you can see it's a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So that red line is where my stitching is. That's the seam allowance, and that is 5/8 of an inch. So adjusting the knife doesn't affect your seam allowance. What it does do is just give you poor stitches. So we've got the Singer S1478, which I purchased from Lidl, and we're going to just have a close-up again. Now you can see here there are absolutely no markings. So how do you know which is your 5/8 of a seam allowance? And there are no markings on the foot. However, there is this sort of bar that juts up, and if I grab my fabric with the seam allowance marked and lay it along there, what will happen is that is in line with the left needle. Can you see that? Let's see if I do it from that way. So that sits along that side. So as long as I have my fabric slightly away from that line on that side, and that will be my seam allowance. So it's a little bit harder. You do in this case now have to mark where your seam allowance is. On the other two machines you may not have had to draw this line. So again, I'm sitting at an angle, whoops, but you can see that if I was sat right in front, you can actually get the right